with our instruments jamming along to that, right?
I'm ready. I'm going to lay a track on top of that. It's so tempting to grab the
I want to
Telecaster.
hear. I want to hear your lead. Yeah. Oh, the telly. Yeah. Hey, welcome
Yeah.
everybody to FSUFO, Forbidden Science UFO. Chris calls it Forbidden Science. He drops the UFO because he's that kind of guy. He likes to get things done quick. Welcome everybody to the interwebs and the YouTubes and the podcast portals around the world, daytime, nighttime. I'm Mike McDonald, co-host alongside with Chris Stiles, notable author of the SHAG Harbour Information. Dark Object is the book that Whitley Strieber's publishing company put out a number of years ago. And we've got a great guest today. We've got Hugh Spencer. Hugh Spencer is a museum consultant and an author. Yes, a museum consultant, and you'll see why soon enough. He also has written two collections and two novels, and they're available on Amazon. The publisher is Brainlag. So Brainlag was it? I think it's .com. Maybe I'll be corrected. It's .ca. Brainlag.com, Barnes and Nobles, Indigo Chapters. You can get his novels and collections there. And we're gonna talk. We got a great show lined up. And Chris, I'm gonna pass it on to you. You can fill in the details and bring in our guest Hugh Spencer with a C.
Yeah. Well, as you know, here on Forbidden Science, FSUFO, whichever, we've had a real eclectic mix of guests. But this will be our first museum consultant. I mean, we've had pilots, experiencers, researchers, witnesses, religious people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But
And even
you,
one potential
Spencer,
alien.
even one potential alien, that's true. We'll take that under advisement for the moment. But the thing is, yes, his main claim to fame, what puts food on the table and everything else, no doubt, is his work. He has a firm as a museum consultant. So, without any further ado, we'll bring him on, and I'm going to hit him with the first question. And there he is, you. You and I have met before, and the first time we met would have been at the 50th anniversary of the Shag Harbor UFO crash in Shag Harbor. He was a guest who presented on the stage down there, and I'm going to ask him now why anybody would need a museum consultant, particularly when there's already a museum there. And I'm sure there's several answers to that. And yeah, so what exactly do you do? Do you save a sinking ship? Do you advise the wise who get in touch with you early? Do you advise about tweaks about how they could better entertain? And, yeah, what does a museum consultant do, you?
Well, we do a little of all of the above that you just mentioned. You sometimes come with organizations that want to rework themselves or renew themselves. You sometimes work with people that are just starting up, and
Hmm.
sometimes you get involved with making them more accessible and more entertaining and more relevant to people. So a lot of my work early on in my career, I've been doing this. Well, I guess it's 1987, which was one of those things. And we often work with museums of all different kinds, history museums, heritage buildings, military museums, science centers, even some World's Fair pavilions, and children's museums. And so we get involved with a lot of content, a lot of different topics, a lot of different types of heritage attractions. And I was doing some research into local heritage attractions and sort of roadside attractions, and I discovered the Shag Harbour Interpretive Centre, and then
Mm,
discovered your film that you worked on that was on space years ago, and
hmm.
discovered that you had a sort of a Canadian Roswell in a sense, which is sort of the way it was described in some of my initial searches. And there was a little interpretive center, and I was kind of upset with myself because I'd never heard of it, either the incident or the center. So I became
Mm,
very curious, and then I started just kind of broadening out my field of research because that's one of the great things about the work I do is I get to study museums and sort of heritage attractions around the world. And and I even get paid for this sometimes, and which is quite delightful. And I started getting more and more curious about different UFO attractions and museums and sort of centers around mostly North America, but a little few in Europe. And I was quite surprised that I discovered there were about 40 of them.
Wow.
And Shag Harbour being one of them. And what's also interesting is that a lot of museums, most museums are, some of them are grassroots movements, but some of them are kind of official institutions. Like, if you went to the rooms in Newfoundland, that's sort of a part of the provincial government, or as the Royal Ontario Museum here in Toronto is, or the Smithsonian is part of the American federal government. They're very, very much kind of the official story. But quite often, attractions like UFO museums are grassroots movements. People in the community get together. I think in a lot of, in the case of, say, Shag Harbour, there's a lot of people that saw something or have some connections or roots to the community, and they put this thing together themselves. That's certainly the case. Go ahead. Sorry. Did I interrupt your
no, I was just going to agree with you, saying that's quite true, and certainly that little and more properly called, as you put it, interpretive center, but they love to call it a museum. Of course, you've been to Nova Scotia and drove around. I remember, what little, we have like an outhouse museum. We have some pretty unusual things that constitute in pretty small facilities that constitute the word
have
museum.
Some really small, some really brilliant museums in Nova Scotia. You have Pier 21, the Immigration Museum, which
that's lovely.
I think every Canadian or North America, anyone who lives in the New World should go there. But also the Black Loyalist Center. And these are like world-class museums. But one of the things I've noticed is that the bulk of museums in Nova Scotia, particularly in the part where the Shag Harbour is located, tend to be maritime culture or sort of pre-industrial culture, history. And so there's a lot, you say the Lighthouse Museum and a number of historic houses, and they're great. They really are. I have to, when I went down to the festival, I didn't really want to come home, although I like Toronto, but it was so nice. I want to spend another couple of months there because it's such a beautiful part of the world. But the Shag Harbour story is quite different in a lot of ways. And it's very, very unique. It's sort of kind of futuristic or countercultural in its appeal and its interest. And I thought, well, that's a really unique angle. And when I was doing more research into UFO museums, I discovered that one of the most successful sort of grassroots museums in North America, and actually one of the few museums in North America that actually is self-sufficient, and I want to talk about the term museum in a minute too, is the Roswell International UFO Center.
Oh, the Roswell Museum is a pretty interesting place.
Yeah. It is really quite fascinating. Have you gentlemen been there, or?
I've been there.
Michael has.
My son.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't. I'm dying. I was actually going to try and visit all these places after the conference, but then COVID hit, and so I've been sort of doing most of my research online, like a lot of people. But I'm going to get out there because. What do you think, Mike?
Oh, it was great. It was at one of the anniversaries. It was in the early 2000s. I was there with my son Liam, who was just turning 8 that year, and Stan was there. Stan Friedman was there. A few other the fellows whose names I can't remember right at the moment, but they had a party too, and everybody dressed up. It was quite interesting. It's a good museum. It's kind of very open. It doesn't feel constricted or clustered in. It's very open. There's dioramas. There's original documents. There's copies of photographs, and good size photographs, like that famous photograph of holding all the kite material or the balloon material.
Marcel.
It's you could easily spend several hours in there, even as just the wife or husband of somebody who wanted to go there. You'd still find it interesting. It's great. Right on Main Street, right on the Main Street in Roswell, and it's well situated, and it's a lovely little town.
Well, here's the interesting statistic I picked up. This is before COVID. I don't know what their attendance like is, but it's a phenomenally successful museum in terms of attendance. It had the population of Roswell is about 55,000, I believe. The attendance one year for the museum was 500,000. So you had an attendance 10 times, almost 10 times the population of the city, which is pretty bad. And I've been to New Mexico, and it's pretty sparsely populated. But they have a lot of festivals and events. And I mean, how crowded was it when you went for the anniversary?
Oh well, it was the 4th of July, so it was pretty crowded in town, and most of the hotels were booked up. There was I have to note, there's one display that I kind of chuckled at. It was a map. It's on the right-hand side when you come in, back of room. There's a map behind a dais, and that map has noted UFO sighting locations in North America. And of course, Chris, you'll be happy to know the first place I looked was Southwest Nova Scotia, and there was no little light with the button that you could push that mentioned SHAG HARBOUR. And I thought,
oh my!
I thought, really? In 2007? Like, really? Are you
for
serious?
shame, yeah.
Come on. For shame.
Yeah,
For shame.
Yeah.
I don't know if they rectified that situation.
Well,
I don't know.
So. I will say, go ahead, Chris.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, I would have thought
you're the man.
Yeah,
of the
you go
hour
ahead.
here.
This is your show. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I would just say it was a matter of pride that my first short story collection, Why Hunt Flying Saucers, because of by virtue of its title on the nature of that story itself, is in their library at Roswell. I was very pleased to hear that. Anyway, I interviewed them, and I discovered something really interesting. Was that they're actually going to do an amalgamation with the local Air Force Museum. There's an Air Force base at Roswell, of course. It's the original one where all this stuff was supposed to have happened.
Yeah,
and it's sort of an interesting combination. They want to move the Air Force Museum off the base and onto downtown, sort of adjacent to the UFO Center, and together they're going to be sort of a joint sort of aviation aerospace experience type of attraction. And I think that's really interesting that they're joining up with sort of more of an official institutional museum, even though they're kind of a grassroots museum, although they're very well organized and run like
I didn't know that the Air Force had a museum. I was at the base. They have a tank, what is it? What's the tank, that the common American tank? The Sherman. They had a Sherman tank on this concrete pad, and then tumbleweeds. And I didn't know that the Air Force had a museum.
Well, one of the problems with Air Force.
What's that, Hugh?
I was saying one of the problems with military-based museums in the States is that they just about every major military base in the U.S. had at least a small museum. Some had larger museums, like the one in Dayton, Ohio, had an aviation museum, but associated with the Air Force Base. And the problem is that after 9/11, they sealed up security for the bases, so it was very hard for the public to get in and see them. And when they could get in, it was under highly, regulated circumstances. So it's been a real problem. But most of those bases have collections, and that really relates to it. Is that one of the challenges with UFO museums and UFO interpretive centers is that a museum is defined, one of the main definitions of a museum, and it's not a totally hard and fast definition, but it's a pretty good working definition, is that it's a place that collects things. You actually have the artifacts or the specimens that relate to the topic of the era in history or the artworks or whatever that is. So it's where you go there to see the real thing, and people actually, a lot of surveys have said that people trust what they see in museums more than they do they read in the newspaper, or definitely what they see on the internet or television, or even what they read in books. They trust what they can go see for themselves in the museum. And so that's why places like the Holocaust Museum or the Museum of Human Rights in Winnipeg are very important because people can actually see these documents. Because you go, that's the anti-Semitic board game the Germans had in the 1930s. So it's sort of, there's proof. You see it. The challenge for museums, and I think I said this in my presentation, Chris, was so far no one's come up with the anti-gravity engine from a UFO and been able to put it on display in their lobby. It's a darn shame, because it's really nice.
Well, here's something to note. Here's something to think about, you guys. Notice how scientists and research institutes never talk about anti-grav, or rarely talk about anti-grav. That to me is an indication that they're probably have quite advanced work on anti-grav. I mean, we're talking about highly sensitive technology, military-wise.
Well,
the less they talk about it, the more I wonder.
One of the challenges, I'm sure, to any UFO museum is the fact, as you points out, is we don't have a UFO and we don't have parts of one. But arguably, we might have some material. But when that material presents itself, and an example of that would be a case like Ubatuba, Brazil, where one was seen to have exploded over a beach, and some of the debris was picked up by many people. That stuff went into research. It's become controversial. It's written about even in a book like UFO Yes, about the Condon Committee, where some of the people that examined it are convinced to this day that it represented a kind of magnesium that doesn't exist on Earth, and that, whether that's true or not, you get such a rare example, you're not apt to put it in some dusty old museum or some new high-tech modern one. That ends up in the hands of researchers if it isn't scraped up first by the powers that be, and it'll be interesting, if they do open that museum on Main Street next to the museum, because at the time of the Roswell incident, first of all, there was no Air Force in the U.S. The Air Force was an adjunct, was a wing of the Army. So it'll be interesting to see who handles that, what gets included, whether they had some contradictory displays. I'd love to go down and see the two of them at some point.
You might actually look at, one thing that could be quite interesting is you could have different perspectives of particularly the Roswell incident itself. But another thing relating to Roswell, which I think is quite interesting, and I think possibly relevant to Shag Harbour, is that they are actually doing archaeological digs. People searching in New Mexico, in the area around Roswell, where the alleged crash happened, and people are going there and searching through. And also, I think there's been a number of sites along the Area 51 highway where people are again looking for physical evidence of that, and it's quite interesting. And we want to find out what they're looking for. And the thing is that there's also, I think, been some underwater archaeological research done in Shag Harbour, again looking for evidence of what may have crashed in the ocean. And
now nothing has
if
turned
they find
up
something, it would be good to see it.
Nothing has turned up, but I can tell you my greatest fear is what already has purportedly happened in Shag Harbour back at the time of the event, which was that the next day, the lightkeeper of the manned lifeboats, as we now know, did recover an artifact, but it was turned over, get this, to the U.S. Navy under orders from the Coast Guard, which was basically his employer. So this is what happened. So then what do you have left to put in a UFO museum? And hey, Roswell, listen to this. I don't think there's anything in the museum that indicates what happened in Roswell. So I guess we kind of returned the favor that way of not getting to mention. But, there's a lot of things there. You were there. There's been some things added since. And I can tell you, in lieu of that, the most popular display we have at the moment down there that was added just last year is a little section, an alcove that deals with the women in the field, of which, we commented and joked at the start of this episode and before we went to air, how few there are in the field. And I can remember there being a bit of hesitancy when I suggested that to Lori Wickens, the chairperson of the group. And, once they put it up, they would tell you it was clearly in the comments in the book, the most popular display. So it was time for, that inclusion to continue, and it's been welcomed, and we'll do more.
And
but
don't forget about
that's what happened.
Very famous and fragrant Linda Moulton Howe.
Oh yes, well, she was there. Yeah.
And there's another issue that is coming up in the museum field, because particularly as we become a culture where less and less is of our of our technology and our expressions are physical things. We're more of a media based culture. And it's like since the advent of the telegraph or radio, so more and more what's going on in our society is things that happened in a very intangible, and that's the whole. But also there's areas even in traditional cultures like folklore and stories, and mythology that are all things you talk about, like oral history. And there's a whole movement of intangible culture in museums, because even if you have artifacts or specimens or works of art, you need sort of people's observations and experience to put it in context. And then you go even a little bit further and say, well, what about just a museum of people's oral history, of what they say? And if you go to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, have you guys been to that one?
No.
It's a good one to go to. Gotta go. It's Stephen Ambrose, guy did Saving Private Ryan and Citizen Soldier and all that. He one of the brains behind that. One of the brains behind that. And one of the things they put in, it sort of was built in phases, but in the first phase they had some the landing craft. This is why it's in New Orleans. The landing craft that was used on the D-Day landings was the Higgins boat, which was based on a rescue craft for floods in the bayous. And so that's why they're making them in New Orleans. And it was the main, because the thing about the Higgins boat is it opens from the front. And so you can go up there, and it opens up there, you can run on the beach and lie down. And you have half a chance of not getting shot. One of the problems with trying to land on beaches before that was that you'd had to climb out of the sides of the boat, and it made it very easy for the enemy to shoot you. So the Higgins boat was very important strategically. So their first exhibit was this big Higgins boat, which was built there, and according to Eisenhower, won them the war, and some other tanks and a few other things. But they had this big collection of audio recordings of veterans of the D-Day landings and their families and other people associated with the missions. And they discovered that, first of all, when it first opened, it was very popular, but nobody cared about the Higgins boat. But what they really liked were the oral histories. They liked sitting down, particularly if they had family, who were associated with that or they were involved with it. They liked to hear these recollections. And so I thought, well, that's one of the things that UFO museums have an abundance of, is people talking about their accounts and what they saw and what they experienced.
That's an interesting.
And sometimes,
is there an actual museum that's oral history that has anything to do with the topic of UFOs or high strangeness or even paranormal?
Not that I know of, but I could be wrong. Again, the thing is that these things tend to be a little bit off the radar of the conventional museum world. People might if you look at the tourist map, they might get categorized as sort of like the Criminals Hall of Fame that used to be in Niagara Falls, right. The reptile house, not a serious place. But when I looked at Shag Harbour, I thought this could be, easily a very relevant and successful attraction. And regardless of whether you thought there was forbidden science involved, or it was just a bunch of hoo-ha, or if it was, all these different things, it's worth looking at because it was very much in the public record, and it entered, as I think Chris's research, looking at sort of the official paperwork that got generated, that it was acknowledged within our own sort of government mechanisms.
It's part of Canadian history.
It's an interesting thought. You the thing about that struck me when you were talking about that with Shag Harbour is relatively recent, even though it was 67, compared to, like, say, for example, Roswell. It would be somewhat difficult to have an oral history recorded. Well, I guess there would be recordings, but I mean, there's nobody with recent memory of Roswell. But Shag Harbour, that still exists.
Yeah, you could get some good stuff, but actually, there are some good. I've picked up some books. A couple of publishers are associated with Roswell, the museum there, the UFO Center, and they did actually pick up some interviews with people, which in some of them are quite hair-raising. There was one book in particular, I wish I could remember the name now, of people giving accounts of how the U.S. Army had very scary people saying, you're not going to talk about what you saw, because if you do, we'll bury you in the desert and no one will know what happened to you.
Nobody will know what happened.
And that's certainly part of these oral history records. And again, we have to discuss what the significance of what that is. Either way, it's disturbing, whatever it means.
Do you know?
But it's
on a slightly different thing.
Chris.
Do you know there used to be? I could be wrong. I seem to have memory as a young boy going over to Prince Edward Island, and there used to be a museum that was shaped like a UFO or flying saucer.
Yeah, it was in Rainbow Valley. It was actually a gift shop.
Oh, okay. All righty.
Well, there's a lot of
Valley has been
roadside
dismantled.
attractions shaped like UFOs, and there's some of the ones, like one of the images I sent you was a honeycomb, and that's one in Pennsylvania, a fairly famous UFO.
Well, I think Sean has a picture of that, a photograph of you in front of that.
Yeah. Well, it's not
Sean,
me, but it's some guy. I've
it's
always had more hair. I've always had more hair
you.
than that.
Oh,
I thought that was an acorn.
Yeah,
no,
but that's a
no.
UFO.
Yeah,
you know this
Not a
one,
UFO.
Chris, don't you?
that's Kecksburg.
Yes.
That's Kecksburg.
Yes.
That's Kecksburg,
right.
the acorn. Yes.
And what's interesting about that is that there's probably somewhere a gift shop associated with it or something, but it's kind of like a memorial plaque, or a memorial statue that people put up. Here's a thing that happened here in our community, and we think it's important. But it's sort of not official history. Now, if you go to Roswell again, I keep coming back to Roswell, but it's such a wonderful example.
And we actually have an image of Roswell. Just 1 second, Hugh. The image of Roswell is you can see the dioramas. You can see the alien and the two people, Sean. That picture. That's striking when you come into the museum. Sorry, Hugh, to interrupt. I've just given Sean a little cue there.
No. I'm just saying is that if you go drive into the city of Roswell, I mean, it was mostly known as being a sort of an administrative center in New Mexico for state government, and the dairy capital of the state. Which, hey, I'm from Saskatoon. I can respect these issues. That scale of community.
It was also the world's first base for nuclear armed bombers.
That's right, and that's one of the reasons people paid so much attention to that event.
That's right.
And I think in a lot of ways there was a very effective means of burying that event after it happened. Because it sort of there was an effervescence of it. When it first happened, it was in the papers worldwide and the radio. Wasn't really much television back then, to speak of in 1947, but it was well known internationally, and then it just sort of disappeared. Not too long after it was sort of, the Army said, "Oops, we didn't see anything. It was, it was a balloon or a kite or whatever they thought it was." But it was, but it then sort of didn't resurface to I think it was one of those VHS. Unknown mysteries type shows, believe it or not, kind of programs that sort of started stirring up interest in it. And that actually was interviews with people, which again are like oral histories.
Yeah. Unsolved mysteries.
Unsolved mysteries. That's it. Sorry about my aging brain. But the interesting thing about that is that I was doing some other research on radio history, and went to an old time radio distributor, and there was the biggest news stories of 1947 on the radio, and there it was on ABC radio, a big story about a flying disc that the Air Force had uncovered, and this thing went totally national. And the way they covered it said, "Yep, we found a spacecraft. That's it." Stay tuned. Now, of course, a couple of days later, they said, "Well, we do." I don't have that report, but it's still quite striking that it does exist. So it does actually mean that in the media sphere, and in the oral history sphere, the intangible culture sphere, which museums are seeing increasingly as important, and historians are seeing as increasingly important, there is a lot going on there. Again, it's frustrating because it's so elusive. There's so many contradictory or subtly different, points of view, and it's sort of
Well,
area, but
that
it's
makes it
again where do we work?
fascinating. I mean, that actually adds to it. I think, it's
Yeah,
like,
I
Chris, you talk about reality transformation, Chris, two different viewers 6 feet apart having completely different experiences, and then
Yeah.
relating
It's
that
hard.
either in text or
Yeah, it's pretty
but
hard to
it's
come
really
up with a conventional explanation for that. One of those cases, I think, are a strong indication of what I call UFO reality. I mean, you can't easily explain them away, and they happen. You know that I've experienced such cases. I've been a witness to one or two myself here in Nova Scotia. I think those are the kind of things, and of course nowadays, Chris, we're in an age where the Pentagon has admitted that there are what they call UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, that they
God
can
forbid they say
identify,
UFO.
but they're saying it's something real, and that they can't explain it, and they're looking into it. So we're at a time when but like you say, Michael, I love the mystery of it, sort of thing. I've learned to embrace the uncertainty myself, and I think
I don't
museum
believe in
goers,
belief.
whether no, these things
well, one
don't
of the things
require. Go ahead, you go
What's
right ahead.
that?
Sorry, we're three white
Oh,
guys
that's
talking over each other. Here,
great.
let
We
me
made it into
mansplain
the
yourself.
political realm. FSUFO is going to get canceled.
No,
Yeah.
I hope not. Well, but what I was going to say is that another thing that's wonderful about Shag Harbour, and this was one of the highlights of that festival, which I think everyone should go to because it's really fun and stimulating, was the night we went out and had the telescopes and we looked at the stars and the planets.
Oh yeah.
Because Shag Harbour is very close to a dark sky preserve
Yes.
where there's very little light pollution and it's wonderful for astronomy. And that's what I was kind of thinking is if you could tie in sort of a national class, it doesn't have to be large, but a sort of something you'd see at the same quality of exhibit presentation as a Parks Canada nature center or something, with the dark sky preserve, you could have a wonderful experience. They're almost like a museum of the open mind, where you can explain this. And I think talk about, because anthropologists, Chris, I think talk about using different terms, talk about what you call UFO reality. In that people from different cultures can look at the same event and interpret them
That's right.
incredibly differently.
As they
And
do, and like Michael said, they don't require our belief, and that's a key point. That's a great statement he made. UFOs are real. The question is, what are they? What's their point of origin? What's the mission
they
of
really
them?
what?
Well,
Yeah.
they exist. It's not simply just misinterpretation. I mean, many of them are, but at the end of the day, and it's like remember Stanton Friedman used to like to point out, it was one of his jokes. He had a dry humor, as the Air Force says, only 20% of them are unidentified. And he would then point out, how many does that take to constitute UFO reality? He'd go, one case. But
Yep.
20% are unidentified upon close inspection. And that's it.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
here's
not about belief. It shouldn't be.
no, and here's the thing about belief. Okay, in a nutshell, in my opinion, the less you believe, the better off you are, because belief is
Sure.
the closing of the door. You know, it's just,
Hmm.
and actually, even I'll take that one step further. I think that people should entertain. They should entertain equally opposed beliefs at the same time, and just sort of float between them back and forth, and then add another. Because it just keeps your mind more open. And when your mind's more open, you see more and you hear more, right?
I agree totally. I think that's one of the things I love about museums. Actually, is the place you can wander in, and it doesn't
Mm.
matter if it's a tiny roadside museum. One of my favorite is the Wildlife Museum up in Grand Prairie, Alberta. It's basically the roadkill museum,
Yeah, I was
and
gonna say.
things we found dead on the highway, or the
Mm.
Smithsonian, or or Pier 21. You can go in there and explore and sort of see what you think. Now, I'm particularly in our time of COVID and convoys and all that I do believe sometimes we we need to take certain things, from authority. Like if you get sick, you will die. But it is good to have people that can think critically, particularly now in areas of misinformation and.
Well, speaking of which, Hugh, speaking of thinking critically, how, and I think you were actually explaining the question I'm about to ask, is how is it does a museum consultant, and obviously you really have a deep passion for museums, how do you become an author? How did you get into authoring?
Well, partly is that I think it's writing. What I write science fiction, folks. Is I think written into my DNA, which was sort of activated, I think, the first time I got home from school in grade 1, and they were showing Fireball XL5 on the local TV station in Saskatoon. I needed to write science fiction. My dad was also a microbiologist.
Communication, museums are another form of communication too, right? And telling stories.
Yeah.
So I guess there is a there, Hugh.
Well, a lot of it, I think it is, and both museums and a lot of science fiction are sometimes stories about concepts and ideas, or historical or cultural or technological trends. And there's a British science fiction writer who I admire a lot, Ian Watson, who had a short story collection called "The Very Slow Time Machine," and I used to tell my friends, it's a good. He's cool. It's cool stuff.
Yeah.
And I used to call museums very slow time machines. And
that's true,
and what I like to say about them is that I think it's a way of science fiction writing is a way of sort of adding appeasing some of my creative appetites and impulses with my professional ones. Actually, one of the reasons I got interested in UFO museums was partly because I'm interested in science fiction, and also ideas that sometimes appear on the fringe, or, as you say, forbidden science, which, sometimes later isn't so forbidden. And the cover of my first short story collection, Why I Hunt Flying Saucers, which I got a good lot of mileage out of that story, because it was not always my first published story back in On Spec magazine in 1990. Predates the X-Files, by the way. It was a humorous story. It is about a guy who gets abducted by aliens, usually about 7 or 8 times a week, to the extent that his boss has to take out missing time at work insurance and all these different things. And so the real thesis of the story is that maybe these aliens aren't some benevolent superculture or society or intelligence. Maybe they're just real assholes.
Yeah.
and really, it's not nice to do this even to a lower life form.
Sometimes
sort of explore that.
Assholes.
And there's sort of a grassroots movement at the local library that he gets involved with that sort of shows different ways of using things around the house to frustrate alien abductors and stuff. So anyway,
you got my sorry to interrupt you. You got my mind thinking, because I just want to massage that thought for a second. People are like always looking for the motivations. Like, what are the motivations? Like, it must be something deep, right? Like, they must be probing for something up that anus, right? Other than just like fecal tissue. What is the depth of this, right? Well, maybe sometimes they're just assholes, and they just want to mess you up, and that could be just as a legitimate reason as any other.
It's disturbing, but that's kind of the thesis of the story. And so our protagonist works out. I think my favorite joke is there's Men in Black in it. Again, this precedes the movies. One of them is an Amway salesman, and the other one is a Mormon missionary. And who are the other people that come around your door and have accounts for you? And so anyway, it's that level of humor. But if I think there's actually even a couple of copies for sale at Shag Harbour. I left a few. So,
well, we have to put a link to Brainlag. Is it .ca or .com, Hugh?
.com.
Brainlag.com, which is actually, speaking of brilliant titles, what a great name for a publishing company.
I wish I could take
really good
credit for it, but it wasn't me. It was
well, that
my
would
publisher's
you're on the
husband.
Rossiter. So, Chris, you're looking deep in thought there. What thoughts do you have of the last
Well,
20 minutes?
this asshole theory, may sound silly, but I mean there is some
I
indication.
knew you were going to come up with something on that.
When you look at the research of people like, say, for example, even like Whitley Strieber, for example, one of the things he notes is that sometimes in these abduction scenarios that are claimed, mistakes are made. People are dressed backwards, when they're put back in their beds and this sort of thing. Well, it was refreshing, I thought, when I read that, to hear that these people, the others, whatever they are, some alien race, may not always be super beings or as advanced as we think, not in all ways anyway, that they make mistakes. Maybe they have attitude too, But I mean, how silly is that? Maybe we're just anthropomorphizing them in a new way. But think about it. One of the great things now that goes on, even in paleontology now, if they can find some that isn't completely, fossilized or hard, is, the studying of scat, poop, whatever, tells us so much. And nowadays, Christ, in our own race, we're even checking the spread of COVID by checking wastewater and sewage. And, but we do that. So, like you say, if they're going up there for something, that can be quite scientific. And, the thing is, when it comes to science, what you want to hear is not eureka. You want to hear what that's funny.
Yeah. Well, speaking of which,
I like it.
All right. So, humor is one of the least treated subtopics of the UFO phenomena, like unless it's some sort of a satire. And that's an interesting absence from human nature, and I say human in terms of actually sentient nature. I don't recall reading anything but the driest, drollest two-liner comment. Maybe it was from one of Whitley's novels, like maybe it was in Communion, where irony was sort of spewed by an alien in two words, but certainly not humor. And why is it that we don't entertain the thought that aliens could be entertained?
Go ahead, you first, Chris.
No, you go ahead. You're the guest.
I was going to say, because you publish more books on UFOs than I have. I would give it a one-word explanation, and it's actually one of the business that museums are in, and that's credibility. When you make jokes, you take a big risk to your credibility that people don't take you seriously. And again, museums you don't see, and often when museums try to be funny, they get into a lot of trouble because you can't joke about my heritage, But it's actually quite true. If you ever, I remember listening to a radio documentary on CBC radio, and they had these Inuit women telling a folk tale to each other, and they're laughing their heads off, and they're finally the radio host sort of said, "What are you laughing at?" I said, "Well, we're talking about farts." This whole story apparently was a series of fart jokes, between these mythological figures.
When it comes to UFOs and science fiction, there has been humor, even in before the classic age. I think about, are you familiar with the work of Stanley Weinbaum, the writer? He had a very short career, died very young, a great writer in sci-fi, especially of short stories. Yes, Martian Oddity, a great thing. And all writers seem to know and follow his work. It's really unknown to the public, and it's a shame. He was a great writer in the 30s and died very young. But in the few years that he put out, it was some great material. And you had stories like Martian Oddity, and I think, didn't he also pen the one, The Day After the Day the Martians Came? That was about how very quickly all the usual prejudices creep in the media, and people are standing there listening to a speech from one of the aliens, and they're nudging each other. I hear when you get close, they really smell, and all these kind of human prejudice. And really, we learn nothing from the experience as a race and a culture in it. And I mean, it was revealing. It was a morality tale, but it was also, there was a lot of humor in it.
You know who was another
But
author, Chris? Spider Robinson,
oh
who
yes,
I
yeah,
grew up reading when I was a kid, and he uses a lot of humor. And of course, he did Callahan's Cross Time Saloon, right? So,
yes,
which of course is the
You
space
kind of look like
alien
Spider
theme.
Robinson, Mike.
Well, actually, I spent time with Spider Robinson. He got me very stoned
Ah,
as I interviewed him, and he said to me, "Well, anyways, he's a great guy. He's a great guy. He was very, very great guy to interview, but I don't remember a hell of a lot of it. But good thing it's on tape.
ah.
That was for a documentary on science fiction art. But yeah, so okay, yes, Chris, authors being humorous. But what I'm saying is, who's to say that alien intelligences don't have a sense of humor, a
Well,
display of a sense of
humor is
humor?
important part of intelligence, and
Right.
often the more
So if it's
sophisticated and
absent,
strange.
what does that mean? If it's absent, or at least are we ignoring it, Chris? Are we, and you,
well,
are we
having
ignoring
humor,
it?
if we ever see a confirmed demonstration of humor from an alien, to me the first thing it indicates very clearly is the power of abstract thought, true
Right.
intelligence. Not just simply mimicking things or
Mm.
saying, here's how it's done. You can show a child how to make a stone tool, but animals, other primates, teach the young how to do this, how to hunt. But if you have humor, if you have pathos, if you have any of these things demonstrated, they're a strong indication of true intelligence. Abstract thought, that's
Right.
where it begins. Humor
But
being one of it.
why is it absent in all of the of all of the testimony? It is all testimony of UFO encounters. Maybe I've missed it. I'm pretty sure Whitley has brought it up. Where's the
Yeah.
humor?
I think we could
Yeah, well,
laugh before we could speak. You know that? I think that
I'm
was
talking
well
about them.
portrayed.
I'm talking about them.
Yeah. No, but us as a race, even. So why? My point being, why wouldn't they have humor? Why wouldn't they
Yeah,
have?
that's what I'm saying. That's what
Because
I'm saying.
I'm sure we laughed before we could speak. I thought that was well portrayed. You remember that movie some years back, a couple decades now? It was a great film, Quest for Fire.
Oh yeah.
And the different early. I think they were trying to portray Neanderthals and more modern Homo sapiens. And when the two cultures mix, they can't communicate. What proto languages they had were different. But when something would fall out of a tree or a rock hit the head of one and cut, the others would laugh and point, demonstrating quite well. And they all would understand that the humor may have preceded language. So why wouldn't an alien
Well, I
be
always
part
thought
of
that if the Adamski classic Nordic aliens accounts are true, then the aliens are playing an elaborate practical joke on us, because that really,
it's high humor. It's high humor.
One of the strangest ways to present yourself would be.
Well,
You're right.
how come these things always crash in New Mexico? Somebody asked me once. Well, the real answer is they don't. But it's a joke of sorts.
Yeah, I've heard that question on the
Yeah.
podcast.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to say I just was looking for a while. There's a long story about how I wrote that story, which I will relate to you another time. But it's I was just looking to tell an entertaining story. I didn't have anything, and I actually had just read Communion, the sequel to Communion, on a horrible flight back on one of those little twin prop aircraft through a storm, and I just thought, this is a very strange book, and it sort of inspired the story, because I kept thinking, well, as I say, I just think so. That was the basis for that story. But there's lots of other stories. Most of them don't have anything to do with UFOs, but there are. My latest novel, The Hard Side of the Moon, is set in the late 70s. Part of it's at a university FM radio station, which I'm sure we've all worked at. Among the three of us.
And I did.
I mean,
actually.
look at us. Of course we were. And then
I did.
we became old men and had podcasts. But The other half of the book is set on a secret industrial prison complex on the far side of the moon that nobody knows about, which depends on anti-gravity.
I like that.
And
I like that.
And it's but it's mostly populated by people that nobody really is going to miss on the Earth, and so there's a lot of 1970s liberal arts slackers working the assembly lines on the moon.
That's funny. You listen, I've had this short story I've been working on for years. It's still not finished. It's a gumshoe based on the moon. And to me, the dark side of the moon, was what I think did I call it the dark side? No, I had something catchier than that. Anyway, it's where any of the pirate missions would happen, right? Or any of these, because you get away from immigration, you can come and go to this in the solar system on the dark side, which is actually not really dark, which is ironic. But
yeah. Well, I just mine was more of a reference to the Pink Floyd album, and because all the jobs these guys had at the FM station. But
right. Yeah. Chris, did you work for an FM station in the 70s?
Justin did.
Oh, okay. All right.
Well, no, it was later than the 70s, but he did the FM
He's not
station
old like
thing
that,
at no, he looks it though.
Yeah.
But he works at that too. Yeah, I'm sure.
But everybody I know who my age, they say, "Oh yeah, I was on the university station."
Yeah. I have to say that this has been a very interesting interview. I didn't really know where this was going to go, but I'd have to say that this has been the most laughing of any show we've had. Hey, Chris, would you say that? Hugh's got this sort of infectious humor about him. Well, it started before we even started the show.
Well, you guys are quite delightful too. I'm having a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean,
I mean, most museum people I know don't want to talk about UFOs.
No, that's true.
I think they'll fear if the head of the Peel Regional Art Gallery is overheard by City Council talking about UFOs, you can assume they're not going to be there next week. There'll be somebody else.
Actually, that reminds me, Chris, we had a guest who helped out at the Shag Harbour Museum, and we had to drag anything about UFOs out of him. Chris, who is that? Noah.
Noah. Yeah, you knows Noah. Noah more at
I know Noah. I'm actually working with Noah on a project in Newfoundland right now. Nothing to do with UFOs, but it's he's a great guy.
What was it Justin said? Oh my God, it was funny. It was like, can you just speak about it, basically, is what he said on the show. Chris, do you remember that?
Something like that.
I met Noah, and that's how part of this whole pathway of events. I met Noah before I'd been to Shag Harbour or heard of it. No, I'd heard of it because was talking about it at this conference. It was a UFO and academia conference at Trent University. And
Trent.
Both Noah and I were talking. I was only talking about Shag Harbour as one example, but he was going in depth about it because he's researching it from a folklore point of view, which is very much like we were talking about earlier. Is that these oral histories, and how people describe the accounts, and then how they talk about what it means later, is very significant. Because how do we put this in context? And again, when I was growing up, and I think it's even now, we really see ourselves as a very rational culture, and we like to see and we're not. We're as prone to mythology and sort of acting on our inner impulses and spiritual aspirations as any other culture.
Funny how
we do have we have some pretty cool scientific tools, but until we realize that, we're going to be at the victim of all those other things.
Yeah,
and that's why I think Noah's work is valuable, but.
It is, and
but I can see why he might be reluctant to talk about.
Well, no, it was funny because I remember now. Justin basically said, "Noah, could you just give us your opinion? Like, I just want to have your opinion." And Noah absolutely refused to engage in that.
Yeah,
and
when you mentioned
credit,
when you mentioned Trent University, I'd like to point out before I forget that more history students from Trent, as opposed to any other university, have contacted me over the years to ask for my help in preparing the dissertation.
Oh,
And I
wow.
usually have to refer them on to other scholarly sources because I'm not an academic. But I've had more of the history students there want to do a project on Shag Harbor than
Yeah,
any other
yeah.
university or higher institution.
There was a guy who was, I think, one of the organizers of the conference we were at, that Noah and I were at, and he was at Trent, and he was a history student, graduate history student, and he was, I think, actually, some of it ended up on CBC Radio and Ideas. I wish gosh, again, my memory's shot. But he was sort of looking at, again, some of the records, sort of the equivalent, the Canadian equivalent of the X Files, of how a lot of these things got categorized and dealt with in the bureaucracy of the Air
Yeah.
Force, the RCMP, and the National Research Council, and which I thought was very interesting and again valuable stuff, because a lot of stuff just gets ignored, and I'm not even
Yeah.
sure if it's anything sinister. It's just that if people can't put it in a box, and nobody
Well,
not likes having their credibility called into question, so they just sort of
yeah.
they can't figure out what to do with it, so they just move on and do something else. And
Yeah. RCMP X files, you were more than just secret files. There are 6 levels of security in the Canadian system. But when something was made in X file, the thing was they wanted to keep it truly confidential. And the purpose of the X file category was, I think they foresaw the coming of the Access to Information Act. And when they made something an X file, it was simply, we don't know what you're talking about when a request come in. You couldn't find it. So it was never subjected or came up for review. But when that whole
hmm,
system fell apart, these things would appear. I was the first one to ever retrieve some from the papers of the late Father Michael Burke Gaffney, the astronomer that started the
yeah,
program at St.
yeah.
Mary's University. And there was a whole bunch of voodoo. It's ironic nowadays nobody makes anything about seeing that X at the end of the HQ 400Q5 Mountie form. But at the time, it took me 6 months to get permission to access that from 2 Jesuit fathers that were left over oversee his will. But that's what it meant. It wasn't just that they were a secret file. They were one. If you don't admit it exists, then you don't have to subject it for review to the Information Commissioner or whatever.
Which is sort of a bit of UFO reality in itself, isn't it? It's sort of
Well,
like,
yeah, what's so
it's like,
hot, right?
I'm not
What's so
seeing
hot?
anything. You know, it's yeah.
You
But
crack me up.
I've certainly working in the cultural field, I've certainly seen similar thinking about. And again, that's when we're talking about. I don't want to get excessively political, but how people get represented in different museums of different cultures, like indigenous cultures, their representation in museums, or the story of slavery and a lot of these issues. Uh, Half the time when I was coming up from the museum world, these stories didn't even exist. These accounts. Again, you look at the story of the Underground Railroad. People who were slaves, or oppressed communities, they don't have a lot of material cultures. They don't have big mansions or elaborate suits of armor or beautiful dresses and things to say that we save in museums. They have very simple culture, and a lot of what gets carried through is the spoken word or music or something, or dance or something that is intangible again. And so this is a similar parallel thing with UFO museums or areas of the paranormal. Is
Yeah,
that many of these things
yeah.
only can be manifest that way because they're not really part of the mainstream.
I
The
think
thing
that's a
is
really
that
great point. That's a really great point, Hugh. I think you make a
Mhm.
good, strong, coherent argument for taking the oral history approach to UFO subjects in museums, and I think you're just the guy to do it.
Yeah.
well, if I wasn't
I'm gonna
so dag-nabbed old, I might be have to decide.
Dag Nab.
I'm at
Well,
that point
Dag
in my
Nab
life.
puts
I
you
sort
up
of figured
over 100. So
I know. It's right up there with malarkey. And,
I just
and,
like to point out the only times that I've gone out of my way to visit museums, I confess, this is a guilty pleasure, was whenever I was near enough in striking distance, I would go out of my way to visit the Ripley's Believe It or Not museums. And I think my
Yeah.
favorite
yeah.
one was the one in Niagara Falls I went to.
Oh, I know it well. Yeah, I actually worked on an exhibition for the Red Hill collection of boats and barrels that went over, were on part of stunts going over Niagara Falls or through the rapids in Niagara, and some of the aerialists. And it was in the Niagara Falls IMAX theater. That was in the
What a great subject.
early 90s. And it's, again, wonderful. And we combined this wonderful collection of boats and barrels. Just fascinating. Again,
What a
that's
great
the sort of
idea.
history. It was
Boats and barrels.
so much fun to work on. And we had wonderful interviews and first-person accounts of these events. I mean, my favorite was Red Hill. Any guys remember Red Hill? Crazy guy from the mid '80s.
I think we're gonna have. I think we're gonna have to. We're gonna have to stop you there, Hugh. We're definitely having you back. The music is 40 seconds in.
Oh,
There's
I
only
would
so
love
much
it.
of it.
I really want to come back and tell you about Red Hill.
I
I
think we can go places with you on FSUFO. We went to places I didn't expect to go today, and it was
well, that's part of the fun of flying saucers. They take you anywhere.
That's the fun of flight. There's your next book title, The Fun of Flying Saucers. Chris, any last words? Just keep them short. We're running out of music.
No, all I can say is keep looking up. It was a pleasure. Used books are available at Amazon.com if you can't remember to get into Chapters or Barnes and Nobles. We're going to have them back, and hopefully we'll talk more about that. It's been a pleasure, Hugh.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really enjoyed talking to you guys. Hopefully we'll all be together in the same room someday.
I'll look you up next time I'm in Toronto.
A personal
Bye.
goodbye here. Stay with us.
You bet. Oh, gee, Daisy.